People from Mexico.
Mario.
Also, if you want to start, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that is good. That gives an idea of.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone. We are so happy to having you today and to join us for this seminar. We have a big audience, so we are gonna use this webinar format. I hope everyone is seeing the panelists. If you see there is some problem on the webinar, please tell us in the chat. The session is being recorded. As I said before, if you want to say some comments, please use the chat and use the all panelists and attendees function. And if you want to send questions for the Q&A later on, please send your question on the Q&A box, not in the chat, because it's gonna get lost in the comments, and we are gonna take the questions from the Q&A. We are starting the Decolonial Epistemic Term and the Idea of Latin American Seminar. This is a conversation with Professor Walter Mignolo. My name is Consuelo Bejares, and I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Education in University of Cambridge, and I'm gonna be hosting this seminar on behalf of my colleagues from CLAREC, the organizer of the seminar. CLAREC is the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective. We are a student-led initiative based at the Faculty of Education in University of Cambridge, formed by PhD students with the aim of constituting a space for Latin American perspective and to make visible the current debates linked to education research toward the diversification and decolonization of academia. We position ourselves working towards transforming our daily academic spaces through learning and questioning our own spaces and practice of knowledge production. This seminar is only kindly supported by the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. We have Professor Susan Robertson, head of the faculty, that is here with us today, and also supported by the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge. And we have Dr. Felipe Hernandez with us here today, the director of the center. We are very honored and excited to have Professor Walter Mignolo with us as a guest speaker, and we are really thankful for his willingness to participate with us and generously giving his time to do this seminar. Professor Mignolo doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'm gonna do this short. He's the William Hahn Wanamaker Distinguished Professor of Romance Studies at the Trinity College of Art and Science at Duke University. He's a key thinker of the Decolonial project, being a founder member of the Modernity Coloniality Working Group. And he has developed and expanded decolonial thought and concepts such as coloniality, following Aníbal Quijano, modernity coloniality, the colonial matrix of power, and the idea of delinking. Among of his work is the darker side of the Renaissance, the darker side of Western modernity, the idea of Latin America, on decoloniality, co-authored with Catherine Walsh, and his forthcoming book, The Politics of Decolonial Investigation. The drive to organize this conversation came from the reading group set up by CLAREC members, where we decided to read the book, The Idea of Latin America from 2006, which was awarded with the Franz Fanon Prize by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. The motivation to start this reading came from our own debates and ideas around the identity and belonging that we feel were challenged when we became students in Cambridge. In the group, we follow a sentir pensante or sensing thinking approach to try to make sense of our reading, allowing our whole self into the conversation and not only our academic or intellectual self. We think this as an essential part of the decolonial effort, especially in academia, to break through the binary of the body and mind of reason and senses. The reading group was a very enlightening and rich experience for all of us, and it left us with many questions, and that's where we wanted to have this seminar to discuss some ideas of the book and the broader decolonial thinking of Professor Mignolo, and some reflections based on the futures of this idea. So first, to start, we're gonna hear a few words from Professor Susan Robertson, Head of the Faculty of Education, to introduce the seminar. Professor Susan?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Consuela, and also to Alex, but I'm sure many of you in Clerica were kind of instrumental in organizing this occasion. It's such a pleasure, Walter, to have you virtually engage with Cleric, but Cleric really is hosting a conversation, it seems to me, with also a much wider audience, and how wonderful that is, and around many of the really important ideas that you've been developing over the last 30 years. In a nutshell, as you say, your long-term project's been around the geopolitics of knowledge. And if I'm kind of thinking for myself around what that geopolitics has been about, it's about the way in which colonizers see the world and erase difference on the one hand, but then construct a different social order out of a monologic. That's fundamentally. I just wanted to reflect very quickly on a moment, and it's Nehru, who was hosting in India in the late 1940s, a meeting of UNESCO. And at that time, UNESCO had kind of committed itself to essentially a kind of scientific humanism, modernity kind of an agenda. And Nero's reflecting at the end of this conference on the poverty of, let's say, a social ontology that privileged cognitive and scientific and rational reasoning, and a notion of becoming. And he worries ultimately, and he worried in that moment at the end of this conference, on what happens to the notion of being. And it seems to me that many of the different cultural, social, geopolitically located groups around the world who have a much more expanded notion of the relationship between both being and potentially not becoming, because that's that kind of forward momentum. So I'm not going to go on, but to say I've read your work many years. I'm a sociologist, Walter, and I've read your work over the many, many years. And so it's just a great honor for me as head of the faculty to welcome you here, and we look forward to your conversations. The dark side of the light side of the pandemic is that these events are possible, and to some extent it feels like it democratizes the space of knowledge production. So if we can look at the positive outcomes of that, but then over to you, or back to the organizers. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Susan Robertson. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, Professor Mignolo, now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really love these kind of conversations. And now with Zoom, as Susan said, I mean, the conversation is much wider and can be more frequent. And that is crucial for my thinking. I mean, I won't get a grant from the FAR Foundation if I say, well, I would like to spend more time chatting with people around the world in Zoom because this is the way I think. Well, I don't think that FAR Foundation will give me that grant. So, but on the other hand, You don't need grant to think. So thank you very much for allowing me to kind of continue the conversation, not exactly with you, but I mean the conversation that if you were reading the idea of Latin America, we were already into the conversation. And Susan, thank you for your brief but to the point introduction. Yeah, I think that you got one of the key ideas of the kind of the geopolitics of knowledge, and and now I am insisting also on knowing, because it's not just the knowledge that is kind of created, but the act of knowing, the process of knowing. We call the enunciation. So, and well, thank you very much to everybody. I would like to be in Cambridge personally because I like the place, but well, we'll do it from Duke. That some of the building trying to kind of imitate Princeton and Cambridge. That was Mr. Duke kind of idea of higher education. Okay, so I will talk about no more than 20 minutes, and I will devote 8 or 9 minutes to the decolonial turn and 8 or 9 minutes to the idea of Latin America, and related to the kind of geopolitics of knowing, knowledge, and understanding. So, in the collective that emerged around Quijano, so when I say we, I mean that. I mean the people who follow Quijano. There are two kind of concepts, the decolonial turn and the decolonial option. Our enemies see us as, oh, the group is divided. They talk about decolonial. No, we are not divided. There are different kind of arguments that you develop with decolonial turn and or decolonial option. Nelson Maldonado Torres is more kind of developing this kind of argument of the decolonial turn. For me, is more of the decolonial option. Why the decolonial option? Well, the decolonial option is a mission. I mean, it's not a mission. It's an option. We are not going there to kind of, we are not missionaries. The decolonial option is a way of thinking and being in the world. Second, the important for me and for people who follow the decolonial option is that when you said that the decolonial is an option, everything else is an option. System of beliefs, we call religions, are an option. System of ideas we call ideologies are an option, Marxism, socialism, neoliberalism, and disciplines are options. So the question is if there are options, when those options emerged, why, who need it, who benefit from them. So that kind of address our attention to not what the sociology is, but when sociology emerged, why emerged. And obviously, just I take the example of sociology, but they can take any kind of example, quantum physics or psychoanalysis. When it emerged and why. So our thesis is all the discipline, all the options we have now are options within the modern colonial cosmology. And I insist in cosmology because from the modern perspective, apparently that other civilizations have cosmology, but the West doesn't have cosmology. But the West have theology and science, and we learn from Carl Schmitt that all the modern political theory are kind of secularization of theological concept, especially Catholicism. So that is so that's why the option makes anything else is an option, and everything is subject to kind of decolonial analysis, analytics, and that is the next book, the politics of decolonial investigation. And third, a lot of people said, well, no, I mean, decoloniality cannot be an option; it has to be an imperative. Well, I like that, but I mean, if you believe in decoloniality, it's an imperative, but for people who don't believe in decoloniality, it's not an imperative. Christianity is an imperative for Christian. Islamism is an imperative from Islamic. Sociology is an imperative for sociologists. Liberalism is an imperative for. So that is when there is all our options. Cannot be imperative unless you believe in truth without parentheses. Meaning, my truth is the truth. So when you start thinking like that, that is you kind of get out of universality. Decolonial, because a lot of people also feel uncomfortable. Oh, decoloniality is a universal project. That is reading decoloniality from modernity coloniality. It's an option. It's not a kind of universal project. All universal projects pretend or act as their truth is a truth without parentheses. And the decolonial option is truth in parentheses. What does it mean? I'm sorry, but that's what I believe. This is the way I live. This is the way I think. This is the way I do. But I don't pretend that you kind of have to do the same. I have to respect that you have the same kind of attitude, that you live also in a truth with parentheses, and that is where pluriversality can emerge, when people listen and respect each other. So for me, that is some of the key point of why, the argument you can make from the decolonial option. And I will add that kind of continue the comment that Susan introduced with the kind of geopolitics of knowledge and the example of India and the question of being. Well, that is something that the decolonial option kind of alerts us. Why other people should think about being. Being in this obsession of Western culture. When I talk to my friends, indigenous people, philosophers and people who study science, they say, well, no, for us, ontology, this is their problem. For us, ontology and being, that is not the question. For us, it's relation. Everything is related. So being is a kind of in Western cosmology, since the Greek, of course. A cosmology that put the accent on object, in atoms, in entities, but cut relations. And cut relations, relationality, not just cut relation from individual, in the society, because, individual, the idea of the individual is an atom of society. But that is inconceivable in a communal way of thinking, and that is a kind of decolonial way of thinking. There is no atoms, there are kind of relation. And the other thing is, and for example, in the Quran, I learned from my friend, the Iranian friend who speak Persian. There are two concepts, that is Bashar and Insan. We are all Bashar. We all kind of organisms, biological organisms on Earth and the universe. And we become. So Insan is becoming. So we are all equal. We are born all equal, biological, but we don't remain equal for too long culturally. So we become according to the options we have, and the option we select, because we can surrender. There is no way out, or we said no. I just want to live in a different way because there are different options. So that is another question of another way of the arguments you can make from the political. So what Susan was saying, I will accentuate that, because The current re-emergence of way of thinking around the world is what kind of reducing Western cosmology to its own size and Western modernity. Western modernity has the right to exist. Nobody, we are accused that you negate, you reject modernity. No. But even if we negate modernity, that doesn't matter, because modernity, I mean, what we call modernity, which is a kind of, not the kind of ontology of a historical period, but is a spread of knowledge and way of knowing all around the world. So modernity is in all of us, different scale, different intensity. So also what we call modernity made a lot of contribution to the history of human civilization, let's say since Homo sapiens, 400,000 years ago. So nobody denies that. What we do deny is the aberration. And the aberration is the truth without parentheses, and pretend that the rest of the world has to live with us, has to think with us. And if they don't do by good kind of diplomatic manners, well, we destroy it. So, and that started, the process we are now on started in the 16th century in the Americas, 16th and 17th century, Spain and Portugal mainly. And then the British and the French and the Dutch got the idea, and they began to kind of spread in Africa, in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, India. And so that was colonialism, but behind colonialism is coloniality, and we have to understand that colonialism and coloniality are two different things. Colonialism, what we call colonialism, are historical period. Since the Atlantic emergence as a commercial circuit in the 1500s. We don't talk about Roman colonialism or the Inca colonialism. That's another thing. And I can talk more about why is other things, but I will just limit myself to say, when we talk about colonialism, we talk about the Western European colonialism, which was basically settler colonialism, different kind of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism in Canada and the United States is different from India, and is different from Bolivia, and it's different from Egypt, etc. So those kind of historical moments that you can study empirically, right? And you can compare colonialism. But coloniality is the underlying logic that all those colonialists have in common. And so, and modernity is the rhetoric that kind of hide that logic, because modernity is a rhetoric of salvation. Salvation by conversion, Christianity, salvation by civilizing mission and progress, the British Empire and the French Empire. Salvation by development, when the United States take the leadership of the world. And salvation by market democracy, when neoliberalism kind of take over the leadership of United States. So what we study something, is the colonial metric of power, which is the structure that the underlying structure of Western civilization. So that has to be understood, because we don't study colonialism, or we study colonialism to understand how coloniality of power works. With a quick example, when a psychoanalyst listens to the narrative of the analyse, each story of the analyse is different. But the psychoanalyst knows something. He knows the logic of the unconscious. So while the analyst is listening to that story, he is also listening how the unconscious works there. So that is a pedagogical example, but that is to understand the kind of work we do. So that is for coloniality and the colonial turn and the colonial option. So the idea of Latin America is part of that. So my purpose was not to do an empirical study, because there are some good ones, of Latin America, what Latin American is. That is a question we are trying to avoid, because when you ask what something is, you ask for the essence, or perhaps the substance, but I mean, let's say the essence. And we don't try to look for understand the essence of something, but as I said before, we are trying to understand how what it is came to be what it is. And that is the question of the enunciation. I mean, you ask for the enunciation. And that is very important, because when you do that, you change the term of the conversation. Modernity tell you, oh, tell me more about that. I give you a grant to study Latin America or whatever, or literature, or art, or politics. I give you a grant to know more about that. Well, we don't want to know more of the same. We want to know how what it is came to be what it is. And if you change, when you change the question, you change the term of the conversation. And that is the decolonial basic move of the linking. You delink from the questions that modernity, and at large, I mean, at the university, but also journalists, kind of education when you are a kid, or high school, etc. So there is a kind of a schooling that frame you to see the world in a certain way. So how you kind of get out of that trap? Changing the question. Changing the question. And changing the question is, one thing is for me, who is from Argentina, who are from Argentina, now United States. The other thing will be for somebody who lives in India and is interested in coloniality and in Gandhi, Ambedkar, etc. The other thing will be from some people in South Africa or Zimbabwe, or for indigenous people in Bolivia, or for Afro-Colombian or Afro-Caribbean. So decoloniality is an orientation, not a model. So that is the question I asked about when I wrote the book. And when I wrote the book, I have already, well, it was a book that I was not planning to write. It was a book asked by Mignolo, who at that time was editor at Blackwell. And he was initiating the series Manifestos. And he was in the area one day, I mean, doing business, and he was in a hotel at Durham, and he sent me a message, and I said, Walter, I would like to talk with you. You have time? We have a drink at his hotel. And he said, cheers, I have an idea for you. I have a job for you. I want you to write the book on the idea of Latin America for my, for my book series. And it was fun. It was fun. Why? Because when I published The Darker Side of the Renaissance, the last two chapters are on cartography, and the last chapter of the book is called Putting the Americas on the Map. And that was, again, how America emerged in the European consciousness. So it was easy for me to write. I mean, obviously he was reading that book, because I said, well, thank you. That will be a kind of continuation of the last chapter of The Darker Side of the Renaissance. So I did that, and so the question basically in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I will give you a summary for the people who didn't read the book. the preface of the introduction is titled Uncoupling Words from Things. It's a kind of Foucauldian decolonial reading, kind of taking Foucault on my side. But that's to catch the audience, because what I was interested in was in O'Gorman, the invention of America. He already did in the 50s detach, uncouple words and things. But if you start from O'Gorman, people don't pay attention to you. So you start from Foucault, say, oh, que bien, Foucault. So what O'Gorman did, I mean, the argument, the fantastic argument, the invention of America, America was not discovered because there was no America. How can something that didn't exist be discovered? And it's true. I mean, it was Mapu and Tawantinsuyo and Abya and Turtle Island, and all these people now are coming back on the name of Abya. They don't live in Latin America anymore. They live in Abya. And the last chapter is about that. And the Afro-South American don't live in Latin America anymore. They live in the Gran Comarca. So Afro-Colombia, I mean, Afro in the Pacific will tell you what, this, you see this line that separates Ecuador from Colombia? That's their problem. It's not our. We live in the Gran Comarca. La Gran Comarca extends to Brazil. I mean, people in Brazil are already talking about La Gran Comarca. So that was, I started from O'Gorman. I mean, I had been working with O'Gorman before, and I was kind of paying homage to O'Gorman to say, okay, Edmundo, thank you for reading Heidegger and interpreting Heidegger from another geopolitical way of experiencing the world. So that was the idea of Latin America. There are 3 chapters. One is a continuation of putting the American on the map, but there is no Latin American in the colonial period. People talk about Latin American history, but when talk about 16th century, that's not Latin American history. The idea of Latin American emerged in the late second half of the 19th century. Why emerged? Because of political conflict, imperial political conflict. Because France, who was taking the leadership of kind of the Latin countries, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, after the 18th century, well, they were Calvinists, but at the same time were Latin. So France became the leadership of the South, confronted with the kind of Anglo-Saxon of the North. So Europe is divided. At the same time that Orientalists appeared the south of Europe. The south of Europe. And you have the European Union now, right? Well, you are not in the European Union anymore, but they are in the European Union. So that happened in the South. That's happened in America. France began to see that the United States was dangerously moving to the South after the Mexican-American War and the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. So France did 2 things. I mean, they put Maximiliano in Mexico, and they lobbied the Spanish-American country to kind of unite under the name, under Latinity. Nobody was thinking about Latin America. And it's more, the concept of Latin America is not being used much until after LASA, the Latin American Association, was created in 1964. If you read the essayists of the 50s and even still the 60s, they don't talk about Latin America. They talk about America, or they talk about Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, etc., etc., etc. So again, the idea of Latin America was an imperialist idea accepted by the collaborationists, because colonialists cannot happen just because the imperial guys. You need collaboration. And especially is you need collaboration after independence, because before independence, well, the colonial goes there and kind of manages it. But after independence, with the emergence of the nation state, you need collaborationists. And you can see it now in Latin America, but you can see it in Africa, and you can see it in Asia, etc. No? So the idea of Latin America is a specific local understanding of how coloniality of the colonial metric of power works, but you can imagine similar kind of analysis for other geopolitical configuration of the world order, yesterday and today. So I stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Mignolo, for that remarks. It's very interesting to hear your vision on what is from the present, from what is said in the book. I think I want to take some of these last thing you say about collaboration and when the idea of Latin America start to be using more, because this is an issue that it was a strong discussion in our group about, I'm not totally sure how to say to not sound essentialist, but actually it was something like who we are as Latin Americans, or why we are coming together, in our case, there in the UK. So for example, in the UK, the term Latino, Latina is not really used. So we didn't find a way to identify ourselves. As for example, it's very used in the US, is a category that everyone's know what you refer to. So I think one of our kind of dilemmas, it was thinking on what kind of solidarity of collaboration can exist between different cultures or different countries in Latin America, and at the same time not doing this in an essentializing way as saying we are this, we are Latin, we are all the same, because we know we are not all the same. An important point, it was actually what we think about the Caribbean. So there, I know our colleague, for example, Jenson, who works with us in the group, he's in the reading group, and he's from Trinidad and Tobago. And we have had a lot of conversations about who is part of what we understand as Latin America and who is not part. And so my question would be about that, and I'm just going to link that with another important issue that we have been talking about social movements. So how that solidarity can relate to social movements and movements about liberation or taking power. Okay, I think that's another question actually, but I'm just going to say it so if you want to take them together. So about how that solidarity translates in social movements, and how what is the kind of the role of that social movements in stepping into power. Do we want to step into institutional power or other kind of power of organization?
Thank you very much. Should I kind of address that now, right? Yeah?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, it's just kind of,
Or
well,
do you? Sorry.
No.
I mean,
to kind of understand what the order was. So I briefly addressed two important questions. Well, number one, you should be aware, according to what you said, of when and why Latin America came to be used. And what you said is very common, because the third world is not a concept that was invented by the people of the third world. They say, oh yeah, we don't belong to the first, we belong to the third. No, they have been classified. But now they took I mean, not now, but I mean, the since Bandung Conference and and the non-aligned movement, they took that identification, not identity, but identification as a pride. And that is happening Global South. Was not the Global South, the people in the Global South who invented Global South. The Global South was invented from the North because they were the underdeveloped, the third world, etc. But now the Global South, in relation to what Susan was saying, this is a place of knowledge. We are not kind of object of studies. So with Latin American, something very similar is happening. But it's very important to know that it's not my essence, that we have been classified, and now how I use that classification. So the question is not identity, but identification. And I give you the example, in this case, I always talk about identity in politics, not identity politics. And what is identity in politics? I give you the example of Fausto Reinaga, the really kind of aggressive Bolivian activist and thinker of the 70s. He said, I'm sorry, but I will kind of repeat his, sorry for my vocabulary, but I will repeat his, his word. I am not Indian, goddammit. I am Aymara. But you made me Indian, and as Indian you have to stand me. So that is identity in politics. Because Indian was an invention of the European. For convenience, when you unify, you control. All the people of Africa were black. I mean, yeah, they have black skin, but being black or being Negro, as Fanon said, is very different. Fanon knew that he had black skin, of course. He didn't know that he was a Negro until walking in Lyon, he crosses a mother with a child, and the mother said, look, mama, a Negro. So the identification is how are you seen? You are seen as Latin America. And I think everything I wrote since the Darker South Renaissance was because of that. Because how I was being seen. So the Darker South Renaissance is an autobiographical book. I was not trained in history. I was not trained in cartography. I was not trained in the Renaissance. But I was full of anger, and I know how to do research. So I think that is very important. Identity in politics. Because if you're trying to find the unified essence, but that is what modernity are trying to do. Including in science, they are desperate to find unified theory of this and that and that. Who needs unified theory? Why you need unified theory? So I think if you start from identification, we have been identified like this. So how we feel and how kind of respond to that. Identity in politics. Because you are proud at being Latin America or being Latinx, but you have to be aware that you are in a structure of, cultural structure of power, where you are seen as inferior of some kind. Yeah? You can be treated well. I never complain I was treated badly in any place, but you feel it. You feel it. I mean, it's kind of sensibility. If you are a woman, you feel it. If you're a woman of color, you feel it more. And if you're gay of color, you feel it more, right? So that's the question of identification. So I don't talk about social movement, but about people who move. And people move because they have a project. Social movement is an anthropological kind of concept that to describe the social movement. So it's like Indian or being black. But people move, and that is a fascinating thing now, that people are moving more and more because people are becoming more and more aware of what is going on. So when we talk about the colonial metric of power, and I have that experience many, many times and talk about these kind of things, we are not saying anything new. People know when they kind of began to understand coloniality, they began to understand what happened to them. So we are not saying anything new. We are providing a vocabulary for an experience that didn't yet find the way to be articulated in front of the powerful articulation of kind of modern theory, discourse, images, television, etc., etc. So the question is, what is your project? It's not that you move. I learned that from Nina Pacari. I mean, Nina, we were in a kind of conference in El Escorial, and Nina Pacari is a lawyer, Quichua from Ecuador, and she was kind of, it was a 3 or 4 days interesting conference. Pablo Iglesias was a young professor who was there at that conference, organizing the conference, and then became so. Everybody was talking about social movement. And Nina Pacari said, why you call us social movement? We don't move. We are nations. We have been here forever. We are nations kind of fighting for our rights. We don't move. So again, I mean, that's what decoloniality, thinking decolonially allows you to do, to kind of suspect of every concept that comes to you from modernity. Don't take anything for granted. Think about when and why and what is, who is benefiting in that concept. At the end, you may end up using it, but you know why. You are not using it just because it's fashionable, because other people are using it, because I didn't think about, oh, I was distracted. I didn't know I was kind of doing that. So that is the power for me of decolonial thinking, because kind of allowed me, as a Latin American in France who was a Sudaca, and if you're a Sudaca in France, well, you don't belong, right? Even if they treat you well. And if you come to the United States and you become a Hispanic, well, you don't belong. And then I discover, I mean, I kind of get in conversation with the, at that time, but the word was Latino and Chicano. Of course, I was not Chicano, but not Latino in the sense of kind of people from Puerto Rico and Mexico were talking about that. But I was not Hispanic, because I mean I was the son of Italian immigrant in Argentina. But you feel that and you begin to move. So the darker side of the Renaissance was kind of the response of trying to understand. At that time, I didn't use coloniality; I was using colonialism. But how colonialism in the Americas, the history of colonialism in the 16th and 17th century, up to the mid of the 18th century, explained me and explained the people I was talking to. It's not, I mean, personal. I began to feel that there were other people feeling the same. So was that was my narrative of that to explain that situation. And Gloria Anzaldúa, Borderland La Frontera, was a key text. That was kind of opened my eyes in 1987. And I tell you, I mean, there are a couple of things on Anzaldúa, but at the beginning, when she said, the borderland, or I don't remember exactly, the borderland is a line of 20,000 miles where the first and the third world greet and bleed. I say, wow, of course. So that the borderland is not just between countries, it's in you. You feel that you are in the third world, and you are in the third world, and you are in the first world. And even if you try to treat you well, I mean, there are other people who suffer more. But when you feel that, you begin to move. And so I don't just write book. I mean, I work with a lot of people doing another things, and that is people moving have project. So decoloniality for us is a project. Is the concept of coloniality. Sorry, I go too long, but we have time. Is not an academic concept. Coloniality, when Quijano introduced the groundbreaking concept of coloniality, he was a sociologist and he was teaching at San Marcos, but he was involved in the debate of dependency theory. He never wrote a book. He wrote a lot of articles that now we are going to publish a collection in Duke Press. But he was a kind of oral guy. He was one of the people who moved, but who moved, organizing things, are also kind of thinking and opening up all this way. So coloniality and decoloniality are not because they goes together. The way we talk about decoloniality is because coloniality. It's like psychoanalysis and the unconscious. I mean, you cannot separate the unconscious of the psychoanalysis, right? The way that. So decolonization during the First World, it was not an academic concept. It kind of was used by all the activists, the Bandung Conference, who were fighting for liberation. So decoloniality and coloniality comes to be the term after the end of the Cold War, because the goal of decoloniality is no longer to form a nation state, which was one of the goals of during the Cold War, right? Well, I went. So all those are kind of people moving, people moving with projects, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I just want to acknowledge a comment that it was there about the use of the word Latino, Latina, or Latinx that is question in the sense that it's erase indigenous people and Black people in Latin America. So I'm aware that that is a concept that is being questioned in that sense now, and that is why we don't have another word at the moment to say that, and that's why we don't want to use it in an essentialist way, but yes, wanted to acknowledge that. And about what you say in the sense of the decolonial thought touching us in an existential way or in a deep way that is not only academic, I think it has been also a very important issue for us in our group in Clarek and in the reading group, that make us go back to the idea of where we are coming from in the sense of our history of schooling and going to traditional universities in Latin America, for example, that goes in this westernized way, and the idea of the internal colonialism that it makes very hard for us to think about the decolonial option, actually. So I think we get this kind of anxiety about how we can do it or what it means to think in a decolonial way, because sometimes we are in the mindset of modernity. So we want to find a specific model or way, and that is very hard to do it. And especially because we are coming from this schooling, very westernized schooling in Latin America, it is very hard to us to think about it, actually. So, for example, when we came across to the concept of coexistence, that I think you draw on Sylvia's Winter work on the book. Many of us were like, okay, but is that we are having this as a relativism, or how we take these different epistemologies to coexist? And it was so hard to imagine that. So I wanted to ask you if you want to kind of expand or to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Um, and because it's related to the other 2 points you mentioned before. So I will start from the first point and then come back to the coexistence. Well, Latinx now. I mean, why Latinx? Because Latino, Latina was always kind of men, female, male. But what about LGBT? I mean, we don't enter there. So Latinx, the X, you put whatever kind of identify herself or herself as Latino, again, in terms of Latinx or Latin. Yeah? And of course, I mean, so it's not a kind of anthropological or historical concept that has to be inclusive. It's people in movement. Latinx is a project. It's not an homogeneous project. There is a lot, but it's a political project outside and inside of the university. So the indigenous people of Latin America have their own project. The Native American have their own project. Sometimes there are kind of connection, and there are some kind of crossing. I mean, you can be, son or daughter of a Mexican and an Afro mother, for example. So you are kind of, you cross the kind of belong on one sense because of your mother, not because of your blood, but because of your mother, you know the culture of Afro-American, and because of your father, you know the culture of Latinx. Huh? But it is a project. The question is who I am, but now that I had been classified as Latinos, Latina, Hispanic, and now I kind of identify myself as Latinx, is a way of acting and thinking. Huh? So it's but Marxist projects are never kind of include non-Marxist. So we have to kind of think about, if you don't think about being inclusive, but kind of being a project, and that is another advantage of identity in politics, not identity politics, because identity politics is closed. Here only gays, and here only lesbian, and here only Latinx. And that exists. But the most kind of, I don't know, effective way of thinking is identity in politics. Meaning, this is a Latinx project. This is kind of thought out, driven by people Latinx, but it's open. It's open to whomever. It's an option. It's an option, but the question is who kind of drives the car. So that is the kind of the project. That's people in movement. So the other question is hard to think internal colonialism. Well, for us, internal colonialism is just a change of the kind of the change of the colonial mix of power. So coloniality continued with the kind of independence and the formation of the nation state. But in Latin America, in Africa, in India, the elite who gain independence do exactly the same that the colonizer were doing, but now are the natives who are doing it. That in Africa and in India. In Latin America are not the natives, or not the pueblos originarios, or the Afro. In Latin America, in all the Americas, I mean, Obama and Evo Morales was just kind of exception and didn't mean something, but not much in the long term, or maybe, but didn't change the fact that all the Americas, from Canada to Chile, is in the hand of people of European descent. And Afro and indigenous are fighting. That is why it's difficult. Indigenous and Afro have now their very strong project. For us, Creole mestizos, immigrants of European descent, well, it's very clear. I mean, I am privileged in relation to this kind of the community, but I am a third world person in relation to Western Europe and United States. That is the borderland I inhabit, and that is the borderland I do, and kind of work with people in the same kind of dwelling in the same borderland, or inhabiting a different kind of borderland. But once you are in the borderland, you make coalition. And that is another important thing. Not everybody has to be with like you. But once you understand the borderland and you understand how coloniality works and separate people and put people in this kind of situation, Indo-American, I mean, like Du Bois said, I mean, double consciousness. When he asked, how can I be black and American if Americans is supposed to be white? Yeah? So double consciousness is a way of, but when Steve Biko fight for black consciousness, he's coexisting with the African in conflict. The question is that when you say coexistent, people say Pacific coexistent. No, but that is a kind of liberal, that's a liberal concept. We coexist, like it or not. But the power differential is what moves people. The power differential moves people in two ways. Those who want to keep power, to keep in control, and people who say, thank you, but no, I don't like that anymore. So that is the fight, and not a fight we kind of bomb, but I mean the kind of fight we struggle is the fight for knowledge. Not because who control knowledge, control subjectivities. So that is the fight for kind of rebuilding whatever our is, for Leanne Simpson or whatever, Biko, our knowledge is based on their memory and what happened to them with the settler, right? But the question, so there is a kind of coexistence is through coalition. What project I can work with, because they walk in the same direction, following different road. And I coexist with neoliberalism in that moment, like it or not. I cannot deny, right? I coexist with neoliberalism, and so in Latin America, sometimes we have neoliberal like Piñera or Macri, and then they come somebody who is like Lula, but then they kind of kick him out. And now in Argentina, we have a good government. There's a lot to talk about there, but so in Latin America, we are kind of depending on what kind of direction the next government today will take. We'll go with United States and the Western European Union. We go with Russia, China, and Iran. So that is a difficult. Yes, it's difficult, but as Lesama said, only the difficult is stimulated. But you have to be aware. That people of European descent, let's say in South and Central America and Hispanic Caribbean, because the British and French Caribbean is a different history. I have a good friend and colleague who published a fantastic book, and I recommend The Haitian, a Decolonial History. His name is just published 6 months ago. His name is John Casimir. It's a guy, because John as a guy. So that is different. It's different. The British and French Caribbean, the imperial colonial legacies are different. The population, the demography of Martinique and Haiti and Jamaica and Barbados are different. So you have to look at that kind of local history. So the question again is for South America of European descent, like Dussel, like myself, like Escobar, like Quijano. I mean, our decolonial project is not indigenous. That we don't have anything to tell them. They have a lot of things to tell us. We don't have to think anything to tell to the Black Caribbean. The Black Caribbean have a tremendous history of thinking and fighting, not just the kind of Haitian revolution, but the great thinkers of the 20th century. C.L. James, what Fanon went to France, but Laming, Glisson. I mean, it's full of people there that kind of been thinking from their own. And so I would say one thing more to kind of see if I can kind of help in our dilemma, the dilemma of people of European descent. So the way of being and thinking of the Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Colombian or Afro-Equatorian, for them is the Middle Passage. That is the grounding. Yes, relation to Africa, but it's the Middle Passage that you will find in all of their kind of reflection. And the Middle Passage and the question of humanity, and that's why Sylvia Wynter follows a long tradition in the Caribbean, thinking, what does it mean to be human if you are a black, and if you are a black woman, and a black woman of the third world. So that is the kind of the struggle for that concept, knowledge of humanity that has been imposed upon us. So, and I finish the idea. The indigenous people have this diverse but long millenarian traditions, memories, languages, way of living, thinking in community, and that now they are kind of rebuilding. That is coexistence and coalition. But then we have for the people of European descent, we have to be aware. We have to be aware that we are, as I said, privileged in relation to the other two large, because there are other people too, but the two large demographic groups that are politically active now, and that we are third world people, or southern people from Eastern Europe and United States. But it's different when you talk about with Indonesian, with Indian, with Chinese, with South African. So there is a lot of coalition, coexistence in coalition over there, because they have the same problem. They have neoliberalism on the one hand, they have China on the other. Well, I hope I give you some ideas to think about.
Yes, thank you very much. As you mentioned, that is one of the, I think, big dilemmas that we face when trying to understand and make sense of the decolonial thought. And so there is a big question there about what we are doing about that in academia, but I'm gonna see if we have time for that at the end. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Felipe Hernandez, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge, to hear some of his comments.
Thank you very much, Consuelo and Alexander. I mean, first of all, thank you both for organizing this, and all CLAREC for really organizing this wonderful event, and for the very interesting and thought-provoking initiative to introduce a decolonizing agenda through education at the University of Cambridge. I think that's very, very important, and thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Mignolo, for these thought-provoking comments and reflections on the decolonial theory, but also decolonial choice in Latin America. I think that's definitely a very good way to start with, because I guess that when we present decolonial as an option, it also underlines not also this idea of the pluriverse that has been present in all the discourse, the fact that there are many positions and we choose. So decolonizing is an agenda that we choose to take part, support, and work with. So it's not a singular or homogeneous agenda. It is a pluriversal agenda. It's multiple aspects of an agenda that we have to always, I suppose, understand. That is, I don't know to what extent sometimes we speak of decolonization, and it seems to be like it's a very simple singular thing, and we just have to do it and add a paper to whatever we're doing.
Yeah, right.
And that's not it. It's a much more complex issue. The other aspect that I think that transpired, especially in the final comments recently, when we talk about the Afro descendants in different parts of Latin America, but also the Native Americans, the indigenous people of the Americas from north to south, is that decolonial agenda, the purpose of any decolonial agenda would probably be more significant for some people than for others, and certainly would be very different. The significance of decolonizing would be very different from an Aymara, as it was mentioned by Professor Mignolo, or for an Afro-Colombian in Buenaventura, or for a Native American in North America. So we need to be aware of these us when we say that we want to decolonize our experiences, when we want to decolonize our epistemologies. That reference to who we are, and also the fact that sometimes, even though we know what we refer to in our attempt to engage with a decolonial agenda, we are speaking from this position, as Professor Mignolo said, of certain privilege, not only because of our own descendancy, but because of the position, because of the place where we are and we are speaking with. So I think that that understanding is fundamental in the pursuit of a decolonial agenda. And also for that reason, I think that we, as became very clear at the end of Professor Mignolo's final answer, is this idea that we need to establish with great rigor the aspects that we attempt to decolonize, because it's not this just, what is it that we want to decolonize? How do we engage with decolonization so that we can be precise as to the object of decolonization, because of the implications that it has for us and for the people that we refer to when we engage with this agenda. And I think that it is in this context that I suppose I wanted to sort of present sort of three questions, I suppose, that emerge also out of this conversation. Professor Mignolo wrote The Idea of Latin America, a book that I have read several times and marked numerous times, and from which I have learned a lot. But then, as you said, Professor Mignolo, you wrote it 15 years ago, and I was wondering, what has changed in that idea of Latin America? We had recently two guests at the Center of Latin American Studies who co-wrote a book called The New Latin America. Manuel Castells and Fernando Navarrete recently published the new Latin America, and we're trying to present ideas about the context of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Maduro in Venezuela, or Duque in Colombia, and the conditions, the political conditions that have led to these different kinds of regimes, or the rise of the right in certain places, as expressions of a new Latin America that has developed in the past decade. So I'm wondering if you could say something about whether that idea of Latin America has recently changed in that context. You talked about grants at the beginning of your presentation, and you said that we don't need grants to think, and I agree. I agree that we do not need grants to think. However, one of the things that one struggles as director of a center, and you would know this probably much better than I do, is that you need money to promote a study. So, and especially in this post-pandemic world, when we see sort of the reduction of money, and certainly the reduction of money from the social sciences and the humanities more than the sciences, the pure and hard sciences. I wonder whether you could say something about the lack of funding will affect the study of Latin America. And that means the study, the other questions that we want to ask about Latin America, but certainly whether or not having the grants will have an impact on all the effort that has been made in the past 30 years or so to understand Latin America from multiple perspectives simultaneously. And one of the and the final question that I would like to, or is not really a question, rather is an issue, a wider issue in relation to a desire to engage with those other positions that are different from ours, so sort of the excluded subjects of modernity, as it were, and to what extent decolonize, i.e. what we call decolonizing in Cambridge, which is to study papers in Spanish or papers in another language, to engage with the work of people in Latin America that has not been translated into English, means a decolonization for us, but it is a process of colonizing the other anyway, insofar as we are appropriating knowledge from here. So it's not necessarily a question, but perhaps an anxiety about the practices of decolonization from our position in the West, as it were.
Wow, thank you very much, Felipe. That was fantastic. The 3 points you kind of pick up and comment, and the 3 questions plus the corollary, the desire. So, well, we have time, no? We can go a little bit over if necessary, or we have to finish at 11:30.
Well, I wanted to say that if you are available, we can go a little bit over. I hope people can stay, but that would be great if we can have a little bit more time.
I can stay until quarter to the hour, and then I have to do something else. So that gives you a little bit more kind of, we don't have to follow the the time of neoliberalism, kind of just quick.
Perfect, thanks.
I will start with the last observation that you made, which is, that decolonize seems to be easy. Well, let's decolonize this, and today, everybody and the family is decolonizing everything, right? And that's good. That's good. Some are serious, some are just taking the opportunity, but that's the way it is. What I'm asking myself in many cases, what move people? Because not everybody who talk about decolonizing has to talk about decolonize after Quijano. That is the way a group of us does it. But the question of what to decolonize, that for me is crucial, and I think that the politics of the colonial investigation is about that. Investigation not just at the university, and that related to your question too, but investigation, the Zapatistas do a lot of investigation to make this kind of argument. So that's what I say. The people in Rojava, Ocalam, for example, he's in jail. He doesn't need money. He doesn't get money. Gramsci wrote all these kind of things in jail. So the question is, what to decolonize? Yes, for us that is why the analytic of the colonial matrix of power is important. Because that tells you what are you in a position to decolonize or to kind of engage in kind of decolonization. And the question is here, and this is important, there is no out of the colonial matrix of power. We are all in. So the question is related to some of the things I was telling to Consuelo, to be aware of where you have been located in the colonial matrix of power. As Chilean, as women, as British, as men, as whatever, gay, Muslim. So modernity is a system of classification, and that Quijano made it very, very clear. So we are all in the colonial matrix of power. It's like the Matrix, the film. There is no out of the Matrix. So you have two options. We have more. There are two options, the blue or the red pill. Fortunately, we have more than two options. But that is very important, because the question is not what you can decolonize out there, if the subject is still modern colonial. So the question, I mean, the last question, Felipe, is, and the example of Castel, I don't know, Navarrete, I imagine he's Spanish, Navarrete? He's from Spain?
Mexican.
Huh.
Oh, actually, no. Fernando, sorry. Fernando Navarrete is actually from Bolivia, but I think that he's based in Argentina.
Yeah. Well, I don't know his work, so I know Castel, so I cannot talk about Navarrete because I don't know what he's saying. But the question is, in the case of Latin America studies in Cambridge, the first question is, why you need to study Latin America? So what does it do for people, for British, for example? When this kind of a study become necessary, why, etc., etc. And remember that LASA, I don't know the history of Latin America in Europe, the study of Latin America in Europe, but LASA is part of a great moment of transformation in the social science when area studies appear. So area studies is a very modern colonial way of studying, because when area studies emerged, the world was divided in three: first, second, and third. And there was a scientific distribution of labor. Economy and sociology, kind of strong sociological science, not just humanist sociology, science, sociology, science, develop nation state, because that is the model of the future. The first world is objective and scientific and democratic. That was the assumption. The second world, well, they couldn't deny science. They were kind of quite scientific, but they were not democratic. They were ideological. So they sent a political scientist to study Russia. And the third world doesn't produce science, produce culture. So they send the anthropologist to the third world. So the boom of Latin American literature in the 60s, 70s fits perfectly well. There is great literature, no question about it, but at the same time feeds into what a great culture is being produced in Latin America. When I was in France, I was doing my PhD, and I mean, everybody, beyond being a Sudaka, one began to feel that I was le dernier gadget d'outre-mer, as they used to say, the last gadget that come from Latin America. So a kind of the exotic, the interesting guys who kind of come from Latin America. So the question is to question why you need to study Latin America and what the study of Latin America does for you. For you, I mean, in this case, the people in Europe, people in England, etc., so people who does Latin America. There is a lot of Latin American, people from Latin America in LASA. So that's a more complex too. So probably Navarrete belongs to that too. So that is a more kind of complex situation, personal situation to um, to address. But I would say, what does it do for you and for the people who are doing that, rather than assuming that you need money to know more about Latin America, right? So that is one point. The second point is what is interesting here is not people who study Latin America, but people dwelling in Latin America thinking politically. And they are of European descent, like me, Quijano, Dussel, indigenous or Afro. So that's, I think, that Susan was pointing out. We have to pay attention. For me, when I deal with, I teach a course on indigenous cosmology, Aztec, Mayas, and Incas. But my question is not to kind of tell the students or the students learn what the Maya were, but to study how the Maya and the Aztec thought. What was their cosmology? What were they thinking? And then how indigenous people today revamp that tradition. So at the end of the seminar, and that for the last 15 years, students began, at mid-semester, began to think about themselves. Why did they know about that? Why they, when in the high school, they show the buildings and the architecture and all the kind of the objects, but they didn't they were not confronted with people thinking. So fortunately today to do that, you have a lot of indigenous people writing and doing interviews in Vimeos, etc. And you have Amautaiwasi, the project that Correa shut down. So there is a lot of thinking there. So I don't study the Indians. I think with them, through them. So, and then kind of help me to understand myself in my privileged position, but also opening up a lot of things I have been saying is because I have been in conversation with indigenous Aymaras and Quechuas since the darker side of the Renaissance. No, so that is why I say that you don't need money. You don't need money to think when you have a political project, when you are people in movement. And another thing I would say in relation to this, I mean, the people thinking with or without money from the part of the world, the region, and the people that have been destituted, is the fantastic book by Quan Xin Chen. Quan Xin Chen is a Taiwanese, and his book is titled Asia as Method. It's a book of 2011. So I have been I am in conversation with him, and I think it's a great book for the address your question or whatever Castell may have said. And he said, well, Asia was an object of study for the social sciences. Let me see, there is something here that I don't know how to solve, but there is a sign that appears to authorize, okay. Asia and Latin America, he's responding to that. He's responding to area studies. The book is 2011, The Legacy of Area Studies. Asia, not as an object, but as a method. We think from here. We don't think about Asia. We think as Asiatic. And Asiatic, I mean, there's not an essence of Asiatic. It's a Western classification. Asia, people living in Asia didn't know that they were living in Asia until 1582, when the kind of the Jesuit went there and told them that the world was divided in three: Asia, Africa, and Europe. and now America, but at that time, I mean, what they needed was just, you are Asian. Huh? So that's another question of how people began to think Africa now. Africa now is an explosion of thinking of African, kind of reconstituting themselves. So Latin America, what is Latin America now unchanged? It's true that the book is 2006. And at that time was not clear yet, not just for me, but in the conversation of global order, was not clear what came clear to me in 2008. And 2000, and I have developed that in the darker side of Western modernity. In the, I think it's chapter 1 of, chapter 1. That what changed radically since 2008 was, let me put it this way, after the end of the Cold War was that kind of period of believing that now is capitalism or neoliberalism or neoliberalism all the way down. That was the belief, right? But in order to maintain that, things were kind of being problematic. They needed the invasion of Iraq. So the invasion of Iraq, whether the towers were kind of fell down because of the terrorists or was programmed, that is beyond the point. The point is that the towers justify the next move, Afghanistan and Iraq, to keep the control of Westernization, because China was growing. Russia was rebuilding itself with Putin. The BRICS was kind of being formed. The Asian countries were kind of organizing their own kind of economy and kind of putting the IMF on the side. We don't need that. And we don't need Washington to tell us what to do. So what happened in 2008, there was a kind of de-Westernization, the project of de-Westernization. And the project of de-Westernization, not decolonial, wait, is a state-driven project that needed capitalism to allow China and Russia to take the position they took in the Security Council and the ONU. They began to stop. The decision from Canada, I don't know, United States and France, I think, is the third country. So de-Westernization was growing. And even from Asia, de-Westernization is a concept that comes from Kishore Mahbubani in a fantastic book of 2008, The Irreversible Shift to the Eastern Hemisphere. Mahbubani is a Singaporean from of Indian descent. Brilliant guy. I mean, he's not decolonial, but he's brilliant. You don't have to be decolonial to be brilliant, and he's really thinking from there. And he was ambassador of Singapore in the United Nations in the 90s. Then they created the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Now he retired from that, but he keep on writing books. So de-Westernization began to just not be a move, but also thinking. People began to think about affirming themselves. So it came re-Westernization. And re-Westernization was Obama's project. Obama began to realize two things, that Russia and China were going up, and that Bush and Cheney kind of made United States unbelievable, began to be unbelievable for the rest of the world. So Obama had to kind of recover that kind of confidence. And so that is the process of re-Westernization. That started with the kind of his discourse in Cairo in 2008, and then Hillary Clinton in 2011, the kind of discourse in Honolulu, the Pacific The Pacific is the Pacific is the American century or something like that. And that is what's going on through Obama and through Trump. So Latin America now, that's what changed. What changes is that Latin America now have the kind of movable option. So when Lula was there and Rousseff, they were de-Westernizing. But when the judicial coup, they were kind of re-Westernizing. Argentina, with the Kirchner, they were kind of de-Westernizing. That was not decolonial. Bolivia was de-Westernizing, but not decolonial. They were capitalist. Chavez was de-Westernizing, was not decolonial or kind of, they needed capitalists to kind of, but then what happened? The coup in Bolivia and Janine come into the picture. Fortunately, the election brought the de-Westernizing forces into it. In Argentina, after the Kirchner, Macri turned into United States. So that is what is going on now in South America since 2008. So you have this kind of movable option between going with China or going with United States. And what is great, I think, with all the difficulties about the government of Alberto Fernandez, is that I think that he understood that it's neither or, but us. And that was very clear in many of his declarations, but also in the way that the Secretary of Economy, who is a young guy, is the way they kind of manage the question of the debt they inherited from Macri. So they are not saying no to United States or European Union, but they are not saying no to China. And so he has been criticized for supporting Maduro. And he said, well, I am a lawyer, and Maduro has been elected democratically. So things like that. So that's what I think I changed. But the idea of Latin America, the formation of the idea of Latin America remain, and Latin America is seen as a unit from Europe and China and Russia. So the question is how Latin America is seen and how Latin Americans see themselves in relation to how they are being seen. So that's what in another context I was telling Consuelo. Well, I talk longer than I thought, but I mean your word, Felipe, were very rich. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mignolo. It's a real honor to be able to have you with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Mignolo and Dr. Felipe Hernandez, for your questions. Yes, unfortunately, we are running, well, we already ran out of time. We're going to have to close the meeting soon, but we have many interesting questions in our Q&A. Some of them are of specific issues that we are not going to be able to address. And of course, we are going to keep them and send it to you, Professor Mignolo. Maybe
yeah,
I'm just
that's what I was going to suggest. If
yes,
you can
I'm gonna do that
and send it to me, I did that already a few times.
That okay, and maybe I'm just gonna take, because there is a few of them that related, and maybe just to kind of acknowledge what people is saying in the question, I'm gonna take kind of summarizing this issue about people asking about the risk of decolonial thoughts being taken by academy or by intellectuals and kind of being close up in universities. I think I have read about your answer about this, and I think I'm not sure if you actually want to say something about that. I just wanted to kind of say what some of the questions
I
were.
want to say something very quickly because that is a permanent question in every kind of presentation I do. And my answer is, it's not a risk. That happened. So, but that won't stop my project. So now that I know that that is happening, that people who use the coloniality in another way kind of reinforces my argument or our argument. So you cannot devote time, spend time to stop something. That is containment. That is what the United States is trying to do now, to contain. No. So that is, and that kind of reminds me of something. Well, but that's what I'm going to say is that you cannot stop your project because there are people appropriating or critiquing you. You have to kind of, that force you to strengthen your project, to make it more kind of clear, or that you can argue. To put to kind of make the decolonial option strong for people who are reading both, who are reading the decolonial option or who are reading the appropriation. So that's also I have a lot of experience that people who kind of comment on that, like you, for example, right? The decolonial is not a metaphor, something that's indigenous in Canada. And I said, well, true, I agree. The decolonial is neither a metaphor nor a universal, that there is one way of decolonial. But the same thing happened with democracy. Now, honest people in the public sphere take democracy as a kind of critique to Bolsonaro, to Trump, to Orban, but democracy is taken also by Macron and by Trump and by Macri. So democracy is up for grab, right? You can use democracy to justify the invasion of Iraq, or you can use democracy to kind of get rid of Bolsonaro, for example. So you have to be, that is coexistence. Not all coexistence are coalition. A lot of coexistence are power differential and controversial. There are other options. You cannot eliminate the other option. If you start kind of eliminating option, you need an army, you need a Pentagon, you need a CIA to kind of to eliminate or you need a nuclear arsenal for deterrence, but we are not there. That is not the sphere in which we operate. We operate in the way of subjectivity. Be artists, a journalist, activists in the neighborhood, academics. All that is the kind of the fear of knowledge, but knowledge control and offer the possibility of transforming subjectivities. So that is, it has to be modest. Yes. The colonial is not kind of the final solution for everything.
Well, thank you so much. I think that
it's an option.
Yeah. I think
okay,
that is
now we
a
have
great
to go.
answer. Yeah, great.
Thank
you so much for being here. And thank you everyone to attending. Yeah, okay, I will send you the questions.
Send me the question. Bye-bye. It was a pleasure, really. And thank you, Felipe, again, and Consuelo for your comments.
Yeah, thank you to Felipe and Susan and Dr. Mignolo. Thank you, everyone. I hope we can keep the conversation, so follow us on our social media. Thank you for your questions. We will send them to Professor Mignolo. Bye.